Some gifts are more dangerous than the giver knows. Cassian Webb had lived alone in his cabin for 3 seasons, far from any settlement, where the land met the edge of tribal territory. He thought isolation meant safety, but when he found the girl collapsed near his water barrel, bleeding and barely conscious, he made a choice that seemed simple at the time. He cleaned her wound, gave her water, and offered her something small from his belongings, a hand mirror with a carved wooden frame. She stared at her reflection like she was seeing a ghost. What Cassian didn't know was that he had just committed an act his neighbors would consider worse than taking a life. The morning had started quiet, the way Cassian preferred. He was checking his traps near the creek when he heard movement in the brush, careful, deliberate, not like an animal. He found her crouched behind a fallen tree, one hand pressed against her upper arm, where blood seeped through her fingers. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her clothing was unlike anything he'd seen before, soft hide decorated with intricate beadwork, fringes that swayed when she moved. 2 long braids framed a face tight with pain and something else. Fear, maybe, or distrust. Cassian raised both hands slowly, showing he carried nothing. The girl's eyes tracked every movement. He gestured toward his cabin, visible through the trees, then pointed at her arm. She understood the offer but didn't move. They stood like that for a long moment, neither willing to break the silence first. Finally, she nodded once, sharp and reluctant. Inside the cabin, Cassian worked quickly. He heated water, tore clean cloth into strips, and prepared his limited medical supplies. The girl sat rigid on the wooden bench, watching him with the intensity of someone expecting betrayal. When he approached with the wet cloth, she flinched but held her ground. The wound wasn't deep, just a long gash that had bled more than it should. Some kind of accident, he figured. Maybe a fall against sharp rock. As he wrapped the bandage, her gaze wandered around the cabin. She studied everything: the iron stove, the shelves lined with preserved food, the small collection of books he'd carried from his old life. Her attention kept returning to one object: a hand mirror sitting on the table, its wooden frame worn smooth from years of handling. It had belonged to his mother once. Now it was just another piece of furniture in his sparse home. When he finished with the bandage, Cassian caught her staring at the mirror again. On impulse, maybe because she looked so young and lost. Maybe because he'd been alone too long and forgotten how to read the invisible rules between different people, she picked it up and held it out to her. She took it carefully as if it might burn. Then she turned it over and saw her own face looking back. The change was immediate. Her eyes went wide, pupils dilating like she'd been struck. Her breath caught. She moved the mirror closer, then farther away, watching how her reflection shifted with the angle. One hand rose slowly to touch her own face, then dropped to touch the glass, as if trying to reconcile the 2 versions of herself. Cassian had expected curiosity, maybe delight. What he saw instead looked closer to horror, or recognition of something she hadn't wanted to see. She stood abruptly, clutching the mirror against her chest, and moved toward the door. He didn't stop her. She paused at the threshold, turned back once, and said something in a language he couldn't understand. The words had weight, like a warning or a promise. Then she was gone, disappearing into the forest as quickly as she'd appeared. Cassian stood in the doorway, watching the trees where she'd vanished. Something about the way she'd looked at that mirror unsettled him. Like she'd seen more than just her reflection. Like she'd seen something that changed everything. He didn't know that by nightfall, riders would be moving through the forest. He didn't know that the mirror he'd given away so casually was now being carried into a village where its arrival would cause elders to gather in urgent council. And he certainly didn't know that before the sun rose again, he would wake to find his cabin surrounded by more warriors than he could count. All of them silent, all of them waiting, all because he'd shown a girl her own face. Cassian spent the rest of that day trying to convince himself nothing was wrong. He checked his traps, hauled water from the creek, split wood for the stove. Normal tasks, routine movements. But his eyes kept drifting to the tree line, searching for movement that never came. By evening, he noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet he'd grown accustomed to, but something heavier. No birds called from the branches. No small animals rustled through the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He'd lived on this land long enough to know when nature itself was waiting for something. He ate a cold supper, not bothering to light the stove. Through the window, he watched shadows lengthen across the clearing. The girl's face kept appearing in his mind that moment when she'd looked into the mirror, and something behind her eyes had changed. Not joy or vanity like he'd expected, something closer to recognition, or dread. Cassian had given away mirrors before, back when he still traded with travelers passing through. Nobody had ever reacted like that. What had she seen that he couldn't? What made a simple reflection cause such a visceral response? He was still turning these questions over when he heard the first horse. Not close, but not far either. A single rider moving through the forest with purpose. Cassian stood and moved to the door, listening. The hoofbeat stopped somewhere beyond his property line, just out of sight. Then nothing. No approach. No retreat. Just presence. Another horse joined the first. Then, another. By the time full darkness fell, Cassian counted at least a dozen distinct positions around his cabin, each one maintaining distance, none of them making their intentions known. They were forming a perimeter, watching, waiting for something. He lit one lamp and placed it in the window, not an invitation, but a statement. I'm here. I'm aware of you. Whatever this is, we can settle it like reasonable people. But the night gave him no response except that terrible, patient silence. Sleep didn't come. Cassian sat in his chair with his hunting rifle across his lap, not out of aggression, but because a man surrounded by strangers in the dark would be a fool not to prepare for the worst. He kept the lamp burning low, just bright enough to see the door and windows. Around midnight, something changed. The horses began to move, but not toward him. They were repositioning, spreading out, creating a wider circle. More riders arrived, many more. He could hear them now, the soft sounds of leather and metal, whispered words in that same language the girl had spoken, the occasional snort of a horse being held in check. They weren't preparing to leave. They were preparing to stay. Cassian moved to the window and looked out into the darkness. He could see nothing except shadows upon shadows, but he could feel them out there. Dozens of them now, maybe more. All because he'd bandaged a wound and given away a mirror he no longer needed. What law had he broken? What boundary had he crossed without knowing it existed? The girl had taken the mirror willingly. He'd forced nothing on her, stolen nothing from her. Yet here he was, trapped in his own home by forces he didn't understand, waiting for an accusation he couldn't predict. Dawn was still hours away, but Cassian knew with absolute certainty that when the sun rose, he would finally see what surrounded him. And something told him the sight would be far worse than the darkness. He thought about the mirror again. The way she'd held it. The way she'd looked at him before leaving, like she was trying to warn him about something inevitable. Like she knew exactly what would follow. Outside, the circle tightened. The night grew colder. And Cassian Webb sat alone in his cabin, watching the door, waiting for the morning that would bring answers he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The first light of dawn came slowly, revealing what the darkness had hidden. Cassian stood at his window and felt his throat go dry. They weren't just surrounding him. They were an army. Hundreds of warriors on horseback formed a massive circle around his cabin, stretching so far in each direction that he couldn't see where the line ended. They sat motionless on their mounts, spears and bows held ready, but not raised. Some wore paint across their faces. Others had feathers woven into their hair. All of them watched his cabin with the same patient, terrible focus. Cassian had seen tribal warriors before, usually in small hunting parties of 4 or 5 men. This was something else entirely. This was organized, deliberate. This was what happened when an entire people moved with single purpose. He set his rifle down. Whatever he'd done, whatever offense he'd committed, that weapon wouldn't save him. Not against this many. Not against people who clearly believed their cause was just. The sun climbed higher, and still they waited. No one spoke. No one moved to attack. They simply maintained their positions, creating a wall of flesh and will that made escape impossible. Cassian realized with growing clarity that this wasn't a raid. It was a judgment. They wanted him to see exactly what he faced. They wanted him to understand the magnitude of his error before they acted. He thought about running. There were horses in his small corral behind the cabin, 2 of them, already saddled from yesterday's work. But running would mean death. These warriors knew this land. They could track a shadow across stone, and a man who runs looks guilty, even if he doesn't understand his crime. So Cassian did the only thing that made sense. He opened his door and stepped out onto the wooden porch. The response was immediate. Every warrior shifted, weapons tensing, but still no one attacked. They were waiting for something, waiting for him to make the first move, or waiting for someone to give the signal. From the center of the formation, a figure emerged. He rode slowly, giving Cassian time to see him clearly. The man was older, with gray streaking through hair that hung past his shoulders. He wore more elaborate clothing than the others, hide decorated with intricate patterns, a necklace of what looked like bone and stone. His face bore the weight of authority, the kind that came from years of making decisions that affected many lives. Behind him rode the girl, Aida. She looked different now, no longer lost and frightened, but positioned among her own people, protected and valued. She wouldn't meet Cassian's eyes. The older man stopped his horse 20 paces from the cabin. He studied Cassian with an expression that mixed anger with something else, disappointment maybe, or sadness for what was about to unfold. Then he spoke, not in English, but in his own tongue, words that flowed like water over stone, formal and weighted with meaning. Cassian understood none of it, but he grasped the tone. Accusation, condemnation, the laying out of charges before sentences passed. When the man finished speaking, he raised one hand. Every warrior behind him tensed, ready to move on his command. Cassian's mind raced. He needed to communicate somehow, needed to explain that he'd meant no harm. But how do you apologize for breaking a law you didn't know existed? How do you defend yourself when you don't speak the language of your accusers? The older man's hand remained raised, holding hundreds of warriors in check by sheer force of will. In that frozen moment, Cassian understood that his next action would determine whether he lived or died, and he had no idea what that action should be. Cassian raised his own hand slowly, palms forward, showing he held no weapon. It was a universal gesture, or so he hoped. I mean no harm. I am not your enemy. The older man's expression shifted slightly, not softening, but registering the attempt at communication. His raised hand remained steady, holding his warriors in check. Then he spoke again, this time slower, with deliberate pauses. He pointed at Aida, then at his own chest, then at the cabin. The meaning was unclear, but the tone unmistakable. He was explaining Cassian's crime. One of the younger warriors moved forward and dismounted. He held something wrapped in hide, treating it with careful reverence. When he unwrapped it, Cassian saw the mirror, his mother's old hand mirror, with the carved wooden frame. But now it was being displayed like evidence at a trial, presented for all to witness. The older man spoke again, pointing at the mirror, then at Aida, then making a gesture over his own heart, something that looked like pulling or tearing. Several warriors echoed the gesture, their faces grave. Whatever they believed about that mirror, it wasn't something trivial. Cassian felt the pieces starting to come together, though the picture remained incomplete. The mirror wasn't just a gift refused. It represented something forbidden, something dangerous in their understanding of the world, and he'd given it to the daughter of what appeared to be their spiritual leader, making his offense not just personal, but a violation of their most sacred beliefs. He needed to make them understand he hadn't known. That ignorance, not malice, had driven his actions. But how do you convey regret across a language barrier when the very nature of your error remains unclear? Cassian pointed at himself, then at the mirror, then shook his head firmly. He tried to mime not knowing, not understanding, spreading his hands in a gesture of confusion, shrugging his shoulders. Then he pointed at Aida and touched his own chest over his heart, trying to convey, I wanted to help her. That was all. The older man watched this performance with unreadable eyes. Behind him, some warriors shifted in their saddles, perhaps interpreting Cassian's gestures differently than intended. One wrong movement, one misunderstood signal, and the fragile tension holding back violence would snap. Aida spoke, then quietly at first, then louder when her father turned to hear her. She gestured toward her bandaged arm, then toward the cabin. She was explaining something, perhaps the circumstances of their meeting. Her father listened without interrupting, his face carved from stone. When she finished, the older man looked back at Cassian with something that might have been consideration. Not forgiveness, but a willingness to see more than one interpretation of events. He spoke to the warrior holding the mirror, and the young man brought it forward, stopping at the base of the porch steps. The mirror was placed on the ground between them, neutral territory, belonging to neither party. The older man spoke again, this time with less anger and more gravity. He pointed at Cassian, at the mirror, then made a complex series of gestures that Cassian struggled to follow. But one thing became clear. They wanted something from him. Some action, some acknowledgement, some way to undo what he'd done, even though it seemed impossible to unmake a gift already given. Cassian looked down at the mirror lying in the dirt. Sunlight glinted off its surface, casting small, bright reflections across the wooden porch. His mother had carried that mirror across 3 territories before settling where she did. It was one of the few possessions he'd kept after she died, a connection to a life he no longer lived. But if surrendering it meant surviving this day, the choice was simple. He descended the steps slowly, knelt beside the mirror, and picked it up. The older man tensed, as did every warrior watching. Cassian held the mirror up so they could all see it clearly. Then he understood what they needed. Not possession of the object, not ownership. They needed it destroyed. They needed the reflection trapped inside it, their understanding of what the mirror held to be released. Set free, unmade. Cassian looked at the older man, seeking confirmation. The man gave one slow, deliberate nod. The price of peace was clear, and morning was growing older. Cassian walked to a large, flat stone near the porch steps, the kind he used for sharpening tools. He placed the mirror face up on its surface. The morning sun reflected off the glass, creating a bright spot that seemed too cheerful for what was about to happen. He looked back at the gathered warriors. Every eye was on him now. The older man had lowered his hand but remained tense, ready to raise it again if Cassian showed any hesitation or deception. This wasn't just about destroying an object. This was a test of his willingness to respect their beliefs, even when he didn't fully understand them. Cassian picked up a heavy piece of firewood from the stack beside his door. He raised it above his head, paused for one final moment, then brought it down hard onto the mirror's surface. The glass shattered with a sharp crack that echoed across the clearing. Fragments scattered across the stone, catching light like tiny stars. The wooden frame splintered but didn't fully break. Cassian struck it again, and again, until both glass and frame were reduced to pieces too small to hold any reflection. When he finished, breathing hard from the effort and the weight of the moment, he stepped back. The warriors watched the broken remains in silence. Then slowly, some of them lowered their weapons. Not all, but enough to suggest that the first barrier had been crossed. The older man dismounted and approached the stone. He knelt beside the scattered fragments, studying them carefully. After a long moment, he gathered the largest pieces and wrapped them in a piece of hide from his belt. Then he stood and spoke to Cassian, still formal, still carrying authority, but with less harshness than before. Cassian didn't understand the words, but he read the body language. This was progress, but it wasn't finished. Something else was required. Some additional price needed to be paid. The older man gestured toward the cabin, then toward Ayita, then touched his own forehead. He repeated the sequence twice more, as if trying to make Cassian grasp a concept that had no easy translation between their worlds. Finally, he pointed at the broken mirror pieces, then at Cassian's head, making a gesture like opening or releasing something. Cassian felt a chill despite the warming day. They weren't just concerned about Ayita. They were concerned about him. Whatever they believed the mirror had captured, whatever they thought it held of Ayita's essence, they seemed to think it had affected Cassian as well. That by handling it, by giving it to her, and watching her look into it, he had somehow become entangled in the same spiritual violation. In their understanding, both of them needed to be cleansed. Both of them carried something that needed to be set right. The older man made another gesture, sweeping his hands outward from his chest, like casting something away. Then he pointed toward the forest, toward a direction Cassian couldn't see, but that clearly held significance for these people. They wanted him to come with them, to participate in whatever ritual or ceremony they believed would complete the correction of his error. This wasn't just about acknowledging their customs from a distance. They needed him to enter their world fully, to submit to their process of making things right. Cassian looked at his cabin, at the small life he'd built in isolation. If he went with them, there was no guarantee he would return. They could be leading him to his execution, just doing it with more ceremony than a quick arrow from the tree line. But if he refused, the weapons would rise again, and this brief moment of possible peace would shatter as completely as the mirror. The older man waited, patient but expectant. Behind him, 300 warriors waited too. And somewhere in that crowd, Ayita watched to see what the stranger who had shown her own face would choose. Cassian thought about the girl's expression when she'd first looked into the mirror. That mixture of wonder and fear, like seeing something that couldn't be unseen. He hadn't understood it then, but he was beginning to understand it now. Some things once witnessed change everything that follows. He nodded once firmly. The older man's expression shifted slightly, perhaps approval, perhaps relief that more violence wouldn't be necessary. He gestured toward a riderless horse being led forward, its saddle empty and waiting. Cassian took one last look at his cabin, then walked toward the horse. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same choice he'd made when he'd first found Aida bleeding in his forest. He would try to do right, even when he couldn't be certain what right looked like. The journey took most of the morning. Cassian rode in the center of the formation, surrounded by warriors on all sides. Not as a prisoner bound and dragged, but not as a free man either. He occupied some middle ground, a guest under terms not yet fully defined, a participant in something he still didn't fully grasp. They traveled through forests that grew denser with each mile, following paths Cassian had never seen despite 3 seasons living nearby. These weren't game trails worn by deer and elk. These were human roads maintained by people who knew exactly where they were going and had walked these routes for generations. No one spoke to him during the ride. The warriors maintained their positions with military precision, but their earlier hostility had cooled into something more neutral. They watched him, but not with the same intensity as before. Perhaps destroying the mirror had earned him some measure of respect. Or perhaps they simply recognized that a man who willingly rides into the unknown rather than fighting deserves acknowledgement, even from those who judge him. Aida rode near the front with her father. Occasionally she would glance back at Cassian, her expression unreadable. Was she grateful he'd come? Afraid of what would happen to him? Or simply curious about this stranger who had stumbled into her world with such profound ignorance of its rules? They reached the village by midday. It was larger than Cassian had imagined. Dozens of structures arranged in careful patterns. Smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing in open spaces between dwellings. People emerged as the warriors rode in, their faces registering surprise at the sight of Cassian. Word must have spread quickly, because soon a crowd had gathered, maintaining respectful distance but clearly invested in whatever was about to unfold. The older man dismounted near the largest structure at the village's center. He spoke to several elders who had been waiting, their conversation quick and serious. Cassian caught gestures toward him, toward Aida, toward the wrapped bundle containing the broken mirror pieces. The elders nodded with grave expressions, then disappeared inside the structure. Cassian was helped down from his horse not roughly, but firmly. 2 warriors guided him toward a smaller dwelling set slightly apart from the others. Inside was simple, woven mats on the floor, a small fire pit in the center, basic supplies for living. They gestured for him to sit, then positioned themselves at the entrance. Not guards exactly, but not willing to let him wander freely either. Time passed slowly. Through the open doorway, Cassian could see people moving about their daily tasks, but with an undercurrent of tension. Something significant was happening, and the entire village knew it. Children were kept closer than usual. Conversations were quieter. Everyone waited for whatever would come next. Near sunset, a woman brought him food and water. She was older, her hands weathered from years of work, her eyes sharp with assessment. She set the wooden bowl and water skin beside him without speaking, but before leaving she pointed at him, then at her own eyes, then toward the central structure. The message was clear. You will be watched. You will be judged. Whatever happens tonight will determine everything. Darkness fell, and with it came the sound of drums. Not loud or frantic, but steady and purposeful. The rhythm seemed to match the beating of Cassian's own heart. People began gathering near the central structure, their movements ceremonial, everyone taking positions that suggested this had been done many times before. The warrior who had first carried the broken mirror appeared at the doorway. He gestured for Cassian to stand and follow. There was no threat in the motion, but no warmth either. Just instruction. It is time. Cassian rose and stepped out into the night. The village was transformed by firelight shadows dancing across surfaces, smoke rising into darkness, faces illuminated in flickering gold. The crowd had formed a wide circle, and at its center stood the older man, Aida beside him. Between them lay the wrapped bundle of mirror fragments. The older man met Cassian's eyes across the distance and nodded once. This was the moment. Whatever needed to be done, whatever price needed to be paid, it would happen now, under the witness of an entire people. Cassian walked toward the center of the circle, aware of hundreds of eyes following his movement. The drums continued their steady rhythm, and somewhere in that gathered crowd, someone began to sing a sound both beautiful and mournful, carrying weight that needed no translation. The older man spoke to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the circle with practiced authority. Cassian couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the cadence of formal speech, the kind used when addressing serious matters that affect an entire community. People listened with absolute attention, some nodding at certain phrases, others exchanging meaningful glances. When he finished, the older man turned to Cassian and began speaking directly to him. Slowly, using gestures to supplement the words Cassian couldn't comprehend. He pointed at the sky, then traced a path downward to the earth. He touched his own face, then gestured toward a nearby water barrel where the surface reflected firelight. Then he made that same pulling motion over his heart that Cassian had seen before. Aida stepped forward. She spoke quietly to her father, who nodded. Then she turned to Cassian and attempted something remarkable. She tried to explain in broken pieces of English mixed with her own language, using every gesture and expression she could muster. Mirror, she said, touching the wrapped fragments. Shows. Face. True face. She pointed at her own features. We believe. When see true face in trapped water. She struggled for the word, then pointed at the glass shards. Trapped in this. The face stays. Cannot leave. Part of you. Stays trapped. Cassian began to understand. In their worldview, reflections weren't just images. They were believed to be pieces of identity, of self, captured and held by the reflective surface. A still pond was temporary. The water moved and the reflection broke, but glass held it permanently. And a mirror made of glass was the ultimate trap. We never look in glass, Aida continued. Never trap ourselves. When you gave me this, she touched the bundle with clear discomfort. You trapped me. Father says I am now. She searched for words. Divided. Part here, part there. It wasn't magic. It wasn't supernatural. It was belief powerful, culturally deep, shaping how an entire people understood themselves and their place in the world. To them, what Cassian had done was tantamount to stealing a vital piece of someone's being, and doing it to the spiritual leader's daughter made it not just a personal offense, but a communal crisis. We must, Aida continued, give back. Father will help. The older man unwrapped the mirror fragments and placed them in a shallow stone bowl. He added dried herbs, small pieces of bark, and a measure of oil. Then he picked up a burning branch from the nearest fire and touched it to the contents. The mixture caught immediately, flames rising up and consuming the glass fragments with intense heat. As the fire burned, people in the circle began a low chant, not frantic or fearful, but rhythmic and purposeful. The older man gestured for Aita to approach the flames. She did, and he made a series of motions over her head, speaking words that clearly held ceremonial importance. Then he gestured for Cassian to come forward, and did the same, hands moving through the air above him, words spoken with grave intentionality. The smoke from the burning fragments rose in dark spirals. The older man spoke to both of them, then gestured toward the smoke. Cassian understood. Breathe it in. Let whatever was believed to be trapped in that glass return through breath, through air, through the natural cycle of elements. It was theater, symbolic gesture, but it was also profound belief enacted through communal will. And whether or not Cassian accepted their cosmology, he could recognize the seriousness with which they approached the healing of what they saw as a deep wound to their community. The fire burned down to embers. The chanting gradually ceased. The older man studied both Cassian and Aida carefully, then nodded with what appeared to be satisfaction. He spoke to the crowd again, this time with less gravity and more resolution in his tone. People began to disperse, tension visibly easing from shoulders and faces. Children who had been held close were released to return to play. Conversations resumed at normal volume. Whatever had been wrong was, in their understanding, now made right. The older man approached Cassian and extended his forearm in a gesture that needed no translation. Cassian gripped it firmly, the handshake of two men who had navigated conflict without resorting to violence. The older man spoke, and though Cassian didn't understand every word, he caught the tone of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. Aida smiled for the first time since Cassian had met Hera, genuine expression of relief. She said something to her father, who nodded, then turned to Cassian with words that sounded almost formal. An invitation, perhaps, or a statement of peace restored. Morning came with the sound of the village waking voices calling to each other, fires being rebuilt, children laughing as they chased each other between dwellings. Cassian emerged from the guest dwelling to find the older man waiting outside, two horses already prepared for travel. The message was clear, without words. The ritual was complete. Peace had been established. Now Cassian could return to his cabin, escorted by warriors to ensure safe passage through tribal territory. What could have ended in bloodshed had instead ended in understanding, however imperfect, however incomplete. But before they could depart, Aita approached with something in her hands. She held it out to Cassiana, small pouch made of soft hide, decorated with the same intricate beadwork her clothing bore. Inside were dried herbs and a small carved stone. "For safety," she said in her careful English. "Father says, you showed respect, destroyed the trap, came when afraid. This is gift that doesn't trap." Cassian accepted it carefully, understanding the significance. This was reciprocity, a gift given freely, with full knowledge of what it represented in both their worlds. No misunderstanding this time. No cultural boundaries crossed in ignorance. "Thank you," he said, then searching for words adequate to the moment. "I'm sorry, for not knowing, for causing fear." Aita nodded. "We also not know your ways. Father says, both peoples must learn, or there will be more." She gestured toward where the mirror had burned. "More trapping, more fear." The older man spoke then, addressing Cassian directly. Though the words remained foreign, the tone had changed completely from that terrible dawn when hundreds of warriors had surrounded his cabin. Now it carried the weight of farewell between equals who had navigated conflict and emerged with mutual respect intact. He extended his arm again, and Cassian gripped it firmly. The handshake lasted longer this time, both men acknowledging what had passed between them. Then the older man placed his other hand briefly on Cassian's shoulder, a gesture of acceptance, perhaps even friendship. The ride back was quieter than the journey to the village. Only a dozen warriors accompanied Cassian now, led by the same young man who had first carried the broken mirror. They moved through the forest with easy confidence, following those hidden paths that Cassian now understood crisscrossed this entire territory, roads he had lived beside for 3 seasons without ever seeing. When his cabin came into view through the trees, Cassian felt something unexpected. Relief, certainly, but also a strange sense of having left something important behind. The isolation that had once seemed like freedom now felt more like limitation. How many other invisible boundaries had he been living alongside without awareness? How many other peoples and customs existed just beyond the edge of his small, carefully controlled world? The warriors stopped at the tree line. Their leader gestured toward the cabin, then touched his chest and pointed back toward the forest. "We go no farther. This is your territory. But we are neighbors now, not strangers." Cassian dismounted and handed over the reins. He raised his hand in farewell, and the gesture was returned by all 12 warriors before they turned and disappeared back into the forest as silently as they had come. The cabin looked exactly as he had left it. Nothing had been disturbed, but everything felt different. Cassian stood on his porch looking out at the land he had thought he understood, and realized how little he had actually seen. The forest had never been empty. The silence had never been absence. He had simply been too isolated to recognize the life moving all around him. Inside, he placed Aita's gift on the table where the mirror had once sat. A better exchange. A wiser one. Some lessons come at the edge of violence. Some understanding requires standing face to face with 300 reasons to run, and choosing instead to stay. Cassian had learned that good intentions mean nothing without knowledge, that kindness without awareness can wound as deeply as cruelty, and that some prices like a mirror that had held 3 generations of his family's reflections are worth paying to build bridges instead of walls. The forest beyond his clearing was quiet, but now Cassian understood that quiet differently, not as emptiness but as patience, not as absence, but as the space between neighbors who had learned, however painfully, to see each other clearly. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and destiny meet in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us. A photographer's glass plate can capture what the human eye refuses to see. Silas Crane learned this on the day he photographed the woman the entire tribe called a curse. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, towering over every person in the settlement. They whispered she was deformed, touched by something unnatural, a mistake that shouldn't exist. But when Silas looked through his camera lens that morning, he saw something the tribe had spent years refusing to acknowledge. The photograph he developed the next day would prove that sometimes, The truth needs an impartial witness, and what that image revealed would force an entire community to confront the ugliness of their own judgment. The wagon carrying Silas's equipment rattled into the territory just as the sun climbed past the horizon line. He'd been traveling for 3 weeks, documenting settlements and tribes across the frontier, capturing faces and places that would otherwise disappear into forgotten memory. His camera was a massive wooden box mounted on a tripod, the kind that required subjects to stand perfectly still, while the glass plate absorbed their image through chemical reaction. The settlement appeared suddenly beyond a ridge, a cluster of dwellings arranged in a loose circle on flat, dusty ground. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played near the structures while adults moved between tasks with the efficient rhythm of people who knew their place in the order of things. Tua, the settlement leader, approached as Silas climbed down from his wagon. The man's face carried the deep lines of someone who'd made difficult decisions and lived with their weight. He studied Silas with careful eyes before speaking. "You're the one who makes shadow pictures." "Photographs," Silas corrected gently. "I document people and places. Preserve them." Tua nodded slowly. "You may stay 3 days. Photograph what you want. But there are boundaries you must respect." Silas began unloading his equipment, explaining the process to the small crowd that gathered. The camera fascinated them. Several people volunteered immediately to be photographed, standing rigid and nervous before the massive lens while Silas disappeared beneath the black cloth to compose each image. It was during the preparation of the 3rd photograph that Silas noticed her. She worked alone near the edge of the settlement, carrying bundles of dried grass that would have required 3 normal people to lift. Even from a distance, her height was shocking. She moved with careful precision, as if constantly aware that her body took up more space than it should. "Who is that?" Silas asked, pointing. The people around him went quiet. Several looked away. A woman pulled her child closer, as if merely acknowledging the distant figure posed some threat. Tua's expression hardened. "That is Nasha. You will not photograph her." "Why not?" "Because she is—" Tua searched for words. "She is not meant to be seen. Not meant to be remembered." An older man named Ohiteka stepped forward, his voice sharp with certainty. "She is cursed, born wrong. The spirits made a mistake with her, and we've carried that burden ever since." Silas studied the distant figure. Nasha had stopped working. Aware that people were looking in her direction, even at this distance he could see her shoulders tense, her head drop slightly. The posture of someone who'd learned to make themselves smaller, despite being unable to actually shrink. "She looks like she's working harder than anyone else here," Silas observed. "She is strong like an ox," Ohiteka said dismissively. "But strength in a woman of that size is not natural. It is not beautiful." Something in Silas's chest tightened. He'd spent years photographing people across the frontier. He'd learned that his camera showed truth in ways human eyes often missed. Faces that seemed unremarkable revealed unexpected depth when captured on glass. People dismissed as ordinary became extraordinary when the lens forced you to truly look at them. "I'd like to photograph her," Silas said quietly. Tua's response was immediate and firm. "No, that is not permitted." "Why? Because you're afraid of what the picture might show?" The words hung in the air. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Tua's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Silas looked back toward Nasha. She had returned to work, moving bundles with mechanical efficiency, alone in a settlement full of people, and for the first time since arriving, Silas wondered what his camera might reveal, that an entire community had spent years refusing to see. Sometimes the act of seeing someone clearly is more dangerous than any weapon. Silas waited until late afternoon, when most of the settlement had retreated from the heat. He gathered his notebook and walked toward the area where Nasha worked. She was stacking bundles of dried grass into organized piles, her movements methodical and precise despite her size. As he approached, she stopped. Her entire body went rigid. She didn't turn to face him, but he could see her hands tighten around the bundle she held. "My name is Silas Crane," he said, keeping his distance. "I'm a photographer. I document people and places across the frontier." Nasha remained motionless. Her breathing had changed, become shallower. "I'd like to photograph you if you'll allow it." Now she turned, and Silas saw her face clearly for the first time. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps not yet 30. Her features were strong, angular, her eyes sharp with intelligence. But those eyes also carried something else, wariness so deep it had become part of her expression, permanent as a scar. Why? Her voice was low, rough from disuse. Because you're part of this community. Because you exist. That's reason enough. She studied him with open suspicion. They don't want you to photograph me. I know. Then why ask? Silas chose his words carefully. Because my camera doesn't care what people want. It only shows what's real. And I think there's a difference between what they see when they look at you and what's actually there. Something flickered across Nasha's face, pain. Maybe. Or anger. You think your box will make me beautiful? Make them accept me? No, Silas said honestly. I think it will show you as you are. Nothing more, nothing less. Whether that changes anything is up to them. Nasha set down the bundle she'd been holding. She crossed her arms, a defensive posture that made her appear even larger. I was born this way. Grew past everyone when I was still a child. By the time I was 12, I was taller than every man here. They've called me cursed, deformed, mistake, wrong. You think one picture changes years of that? I don't know what it changes, Silas admitted. But I know that sometimes people need to see something from a different angle before they can see it at all. She laughed. But there was no humor in it. Different angle. As if standing in different light would make me smaller. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Silas pulled out one of the photographs he'd taken earlier that day. A portrait of one of the settlement's elders. Look at this man. When you see him standing there moving around, you notice his limp. You notice how he squints. But in this photograph, look what you see instead. Nasha took the image reluctantly, holding it carefully by the edges. She stared at it for a long moment. Dignity, she said quietly. Strength. Experience. Exactly. The camera removes everything except what's essential. No movement, no context, no assumptions. Just the person as they are in that single moment. Nasha handed back the photograph. Her expression had softened slightly, but doubt still dominated her features. And you think if they see me frozen in a picture, suddenly I'm not the mistake they've always seen. I think they've never actually looked at you. Not really. They've only looked at their fear of what you represent. The words struck something in her. She turned away, but not before Silas saw her jaw tighten with emotion. When she spoke again, her voice was even rougher. When will you do it? Tomorrow morning. Early. When the light is clear. Where? Here. Where you work. Where you choose to be. Nasha nodded slowly, still not facing him. One photograph. That's all. That's all I need. She picked up another bundle of grass, signaling the conversation was over. But as Silas walked back toward his wagon, he heard her voice one more time, barely above a whisper. They won't like this. Silas stopped, turned back. I know. They might make you leave. I know that too. Nasha finally looked at him directly, her eyes searching his face for something. Deception, mockery, pity. Whatever she was looking for, she didn't seem to find it. She just nodded once and returned to her work. But as Silas walked away, one question burned in his mind. If the photograph revealed what he suspected it would the truth be enough to break through years of judgment? Or would it simply prove that some people would rather live with comfortable lies than face uncomfortable reality? Bad news travels faster than good intentions. By evening, the entire settlement knew about Silas's plan. He was preparing his chemicals in the wagon when Tua appeared, flanked by Ohiteka and 3 other men. Their expressions carried the weight of unified disapproval. We welcomed you here, Tua said without preamble. Gave you permission to document our people, but you've chosen to disrespect our wishes. Silas set down the glass plate he'd been cleaning. I asked Nasha for permission. She gave it. She has no authority to give, Ohiteka snapped. She is nothing, less than nothing. She's a person who exists in this settlement. That makes her part of your community whether you acknowledge it or not. Tua's jaw tightened. You don't understand our ways. Nasha is a burden we've carried since her birth. Her mother died bringing her into this world. Her father couldn't bear to look at her and left before she was 3 years old. The spirits made an error with her and we've suffered that error ever since. What exactly has she done that causes suffering? Silas asked. The question hung in the air. The men exchanged glances. She exists wrong, Ohiteka finally said. Her size is unnatural. Women should not tower over men. It disrupts the order of things. So, her crime is being born different. Her crime, Tua said firmly, is being a constant reminder of imperfection in a world that requires balance. Every time we see her, we're reminded that nature can create mistakes. That disturbs the harmony we try to maintain. Silas studied the men before him. Their conviction was absolute, polished smooth by years of repetition. They genuinely believed what they were saying. That made it worse somehow. Then maybe it's your harmony that's the mistake, Silas said quietly. Maybe what's disturbed isn't the natural order, but your comfort. Ohiteka stepped forward, his voice rising. You come here as a guest and insult our understanding of the world? You know nothing of our beliefs. Our traditions. That woman is wrong. The spirits know it. We know it. Only you, an outsider with your wooden box, seem blind to the truth. Or maybe I'm the only one actually looking. Tua raised a hand, stopping Ohiteka from responding. His voice remained controlled, but steel had entered it. If you photograph Nasha, you will leave immediately. We will not permit those images to exist. We will not allow her to be remembered or documented as if she were normal. Why? Silas pressed. What are you afraid will happen if someone sees her in a photograph? We fear nothing, Tua said coldly. But we will not have our settlement associated with abnormality. We will not have strangers looking at pictures of our people and seeing her, thinking she represents us. She does represent you, Silas said. She represents how you treat those who are different. The silence that followed was dangerous. Ohiteka's hands had curled into fists. The other men shifted their weight, ready to act if violence became necessary. Tua spoke with careful precision. You have until dawn to make your choice. Photograph only those we've approved or leave our territory. Those are your only options. And if I choose to photograph her anyway, then you choose to lose your equipment, your chemicals, and possibly more. We are not violent people by nature, but we protect what matters to us. And what matters is that Nasha remains what she's always been, unseen, undocumented, forgotten. The men turned to leave, but Tua paused at the edge of the wagon. You think you're doing something noble, giving voice to the voiceless. But sometimes people are voiceless because their voice has nothing worth hearing. After they left, Silas sat in the wagon surrounded by his equipment. The glass plates reflected lamplight in his hands, fragile. Expensive, irreplaceable. He'd spent 5 years building this collection of frontier images. Losing it would mean losing not just tools, but his entire livelihood. But as he looked toward the edge of the settlement where Nasha's small dwelling sat dark and isolated, he thought about what it meant to be deliberately erased. To be told your existence was so offensive that even preserving your image was considered an insult to others. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. The question was whether truth documented was worth the price of everything you owned, and whether one photograph could possibly be powerful enough to justify that cost. Dawn arrived with the kind of clarity that makes everything visible, whether you want to see it or not. Silas set up his camera in the open ground where Nasha worked. The massive wooden box sat mounted on its tripod, the brass lens gleaming in early light. He'd chosen this location deliberately. No shadows, no obstacles, nothing to hide behind. If he was going to do this, it would be done in full view of everyone. The settlement was already awake. People moved through their morning routines, but every single person was aware of what was about to happen. Silas could feel their attention like weight pressing against his back. Nasha appeared from her dwelling. She walked slowly, her shoulders squared but her face carefully blank. She'd prepared herself for this moment. That much was obvious. But preparation couldn't erase the tension in her movements or the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Where do you want me? Her voice was steady, controlled. Right there, where you always stand. She positioned herself in front of the camera, her full height on display. Even now, knowing he was about to photograph her, Silas felt the shock of her stature. She was remarkable, not deformed, not cursed, but genuinely extraordinary in her physical presence. Behind him, Silas heard footsteps. Tua and Ohiteka had emerged from the central dwelling, along with most of the settlement's adults. They formed a loose semicircle at a distance, watching, waiting. Stand naturally, Silas said to Nasha, ducking beneath the black cloth to check the composition. Don't pose. Don't try to look any particular way. Just be. Through the inverted image on the ground glass, everything reversed. Dark became light, left became right. But even inverted, even backwards, Nasha's presence dominated the frame. The camera saw her exactly as she was, powerful, solid, undeniable. Hold perfectly still, Silas instructed, removing the dark slide from the plate holder. Don't move for 30 seconds. Don't even breathe deeply. Nasha froze. Silas removed the lens cap. counting silently as the chemical coating on the glass plate absorbed light, absorbed her image, transformed silver particles into permanent memory. 20 seconds. 25. 30. He replaced the lens cap and slid the dark slide back into place. Done. First one complete. From the watching crowd, someone spat on the ground. Others murmured among themselves, their voices carrying disapproval that bordered on disgust. 2 more, Silas said. Ignoring them, he pulled out another prepared plate. Different angles. I want one from slightly lower. Looking up. Why? Nasha asked, her voice tight. Because that's how children would see you. And I want to capture that perspective. Something shifted in her expression. For just a moment, vulnerability broke through her careful control. Children, the ones who ran from her, who were taught from birth that she represented something wrong, something to fear. Silas adjusted the camera height, lowering it significantly. Through the lens now, Nasha appeared even more imposing, a figure that could shield, could protect, could shelter anyone small enough to stand beneath her shadow. Hold still again. Another 30 seconds. Another plate exposed. Another image captured. The crowd had grown larger. More people had emerged to witness this act of defiance. Kaya, the curious child from the day before, stood near the front, her eyes wide with fascination rather than fear. One more, Silas said, loading the final plate. This one from your right side. Profile. Nasha turned, presenting her face in stark profile against the empty sky. The angle revealed the strong line of her jaw, the dignified set of her features, the quiet determination in her posture. 30 seconds more, the final plate exposed. As Silas began dismantling his equipment, Tua stepped forward. His expression was unreadable, but his voice carried absolute finality. You've made your choice. Pack your wagon. You have 1 hour before we escort you to the territorial boundary. The plates need time to develop properly, Silas said calmly. I'll leave when the images are ready. You'll leave now. Tomorrow, Silas countered. Give me until tomorrow morning. The chemicals require proper processing. If I rush it, the images will be ruined. Ohiteka spoke up, his voice sharp. Then ruin them. We don't want those pictures to exist anyway. But Tua raised a hand, silencing him. The leader studied Silas for a long moment, calculation moving behind his eyes. Tomorrow at dawn, not a moment later. And those plates stay in your wagon until you're gone. We will not see them. Agreed, Silas said, though he had no intention of keeping that promise. As the crowd dispersed, Nasha remained standing where she'd been photographed. She looked at Silas with an expression he couldn't quite name, hope mixed with something darker, something that looked like preparation for inevitable disappointment. Will they really show something different? She asked quietly. Tomorrow, Silas said. You'll see for yourself. But as he carried his equipment back to the wagon, one question consumed him. What if the truth captured on those plates wasn't enough? What if beauty, dignity, and worth could exist in an image but still be rejected by eyes that refuse to see? Truth doesn't reveal itself in bright light. It emerges slowly in darkness, one careful step at a time. Silas worked through the night in his wagon, which he'd converted into a temporary darkroom. Red-filtered lamplight cast everything in crimson shadow. The air was thick with chemical smell: silver nitrate, ferrous sulfate, potassium cyanide. Each substance had to be mixed in precise ratios, applied in exact sequence, or the images would be lost forever. He started with the first plate, the one taken straight on. Carefully, he immersed the glass in the developer solution, watching as the latent image began to appear like something rising from beneath water. At first, only shadows, dark areas where light had struck the treated glass, light areas where shadows had fallen, everything backwards, everything reversed, a negative waiting to be transformed into truth. But even in negative form, even inverted and strange, something was already visible, something that made Silas's breath catch. He transferred the plate to the fixing bath, the chemical that would make the image permanent. Minutes passed while the solution worked its invisible magic, locking silver particles in place, ensuring they wouldn't fade when exposed to light. Finally, he lifted the plate, rinsed it carefully in clean water, and held it up to the red lamp. The negative showed Nasha in stark reversal, her dark clothing appearing light, her skin rendered pale. But the composition was extraordinary. She stood centered, perfectly balanced, her posture revealing something the naked eye had somehow missed. Not awkwardness, not deformity, but presence, command, the kind of bearing that suggested strength earned through surviving what would have broken others. Silas immediately began processing the second plate, the one taken from the lower angle. This one took longer to develop, the image forming with agonizing slowness. When it finally emerged, Silas understood why he'd felt compelled to take this particular angle. From below, looking up, Nasha appeared monumental. Not threatening, not monstrous, protective. The angle transformed her height from abnormality into shelter, into the kind of presence that could stand between danger and those smaller than herself. Behind her in the frame, the empty sky stretched wide, but she dominated it, anchored it, made it seem less vast by providing scale and reference. This was how children could see her, if fear hadn't taught them otherwise. This was how she could be seen not as mistake, but as guardian. The third plate processed fastest, as if eager to reveal itself. The profile shot captured her features with unforgiving clarity. Every line of her face, every angle, rendered in sharp detail. And there it was, the truth that eyes clouded by prejudice had refused to acknowledge. Nasha's face held undeniable dignity. Her expression carried the weight of someone who'd endured judgment without letting it destroy her essential self. There was no defeat in her features, no surrender to others' opinions. Just quiet, persistent existence in a world that insisted she shouldn't be. Silas set all three plates carefully on the drying rack. In the red lamplight, they glowed like windows into an alternate reality, one where truth superseded assumption, where the camera's impartial eye revealed what human prejudice had spent years concealing. But revelation required audience. These images meant nothing locked in a dark room, seen only by the man who'd taken them. Tomorrow, when he showed these photographs to the settlement, one of two things would happen. Either they would be forced to confront the gap between what they'd chosen to see and what actually existed, or they would double down on their judgment, reject the evidence of their own eyes, and prove that some people preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truth. The chemistry was finished, the images were permanent, but the real test hadn't even begun. As Silas extinguished the red lamp and stepped out into the night air, he looked toward Nasha's dwelling. A single small light burned in her window. She was awake, probably wondering the same thing he was. Would truth documented be enough to change minds that had spent years calcifying around prejudice? Or would the photographs simply prove that some people would rather destroy evidence than admit they'd been wrong? By dawn, the entire settlement would have their answer. And so would Nasha, whether her existence could ever be seen as anything other than mistake, or whether one photograph could force an entire community to finally look at what had always been there. Children see the world before they're taught what to ignore. Silas was packing the last of his chemical bottles when he heard the soft footsteps outside his wagon. Dawn was still an hour away, the sky that deep blue that comes just before light. He turned to find Kaya standing there, the curious child who'd watched the photography session with fascination instead of fear. "You're supposed to leave," she said quietly, glancing back toward the settlement. "I know, I'm almost ready." Kaya hesitated, then stepped closer. Did they work? The shadow pictures of the tall woman? Silas studied the child's face. No fear there, no disgust, just genuine curiosity. "They worked. Would you like to see?" Her eyes widened. She nodded quickly. Silas retrieved the 3 glass plates, now fully dried and ready to be printed. In the pre-dawn darkness, he held them up to his lamp one at a time, letting the light shine through the negative images. Kaya stared at the first plate with intense concentration. Even in negative form, where everything appeared reversed and strange, the composition was clear. She tilted her head, studying it from different angles. "She looks strong," Kaya said finally, "like she could carry anything." "She is strong," Silas agreed, moving to the second plate, the one taken from below. Kaya gasped softly. "She looks like a guardian, like someone who could protect everyone." "That's exactly what I saw through the lens." The third plate, the profile shot, held Kaya's attention longest. She reached out as if to touch it, then pulled her hand back. "Her face isn't wrong." "Why do they say it's wrong?" "Because people sometimes decide something is wrong before they actually look at it. And once they've decided, they stop looking." Kaya was quiet for a moment, still staring at the image. "I've never seen her this close before. They always tell me to stay away. But in this picture, she just looks like someone who's been sad for a long time." The observation struck Silas with unexpected force. Children, he thought, saw what adults had trained themselves not to see. "Can I show these to my mother?" Kaya asked suddenly. Your mother might not want to see them. She will. She's not like the others. She just doesn't say it out loud because they'd get angry. Before Silas could respond, more footsteps approached. He tensed, expecting Tua or Ohiteka, but instead a woman appeared, Kaya's mother, judging by the resemblance. Her expression was cautious, but not hostile. Kaya, you shouldn't be here. Mother, look at the pictures. The woman started to refuse, but something in her daughter's voice made her pause. She stepped closer, allowing Silas to show her the plates. Her reaction was slower than Kaya's, more guarded. Years of learned prejudice fought against what her eyes were actually seeing. But gradually, her expression shifted. Surprise, then something that might have been shame, flickered across her features. This is how she looks, the woman asked quietly. This is how the camera sees her. Without judgment, without fear. The woman stared at the profile shot for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. We've been cruel to her, all of us, for so many years. Can you tell the others? Kaya asked her mother eagerly. Can you make them see? Her mother shook her head slowly. They won't believe me. They'll say I'm being weak, letting an outsider influence my thinking. But, she looked at Silas. But if they saw these themselves? If they had to look directly at what you've captured? Maybe then. Tua said the plates had to stay in my wagon until I left. Tua isn't awake yet, the woman said, a hint of defiance entering her voice. And dawn is still coming. There's time. Silas understood what she was suggesting. Bring the images out. Force the settlement to confront them before the wagon rolled away and the evidence disappeared forever. It would violate Tua's direct command. It would likely provoke the very confrontation Silas had tried to avoid. But it might also be the only chance for truth to break through years of willful blindness. Kaya looked up at him with those clear, unjudging eyes. She should know that someone finally saw her right. Even if everyone else still doesn't. She should know. And Silas realized the child was absolutely correct. Whatever happened next, Nasha deserved to see these images. She deserved to witness the proof that she'd been seen, truly seen at least once in her life. Go wake your father, the mother said to Kaya. Tell him he needs to come to the central fire. Tell him it's important. Then wake the others, everyone. Tell them to come. As Kaya ran off, the woman met Silas's eyes. You'll need help carrying those plates. Together, they began gathering the photographs. The truth was about to be revealed, whether the settlement was ready for it or not. Some truths arrive quietly, but their impact echoes loud. By the time the settlement gathered at the central fire, the sky had begun its slow shift toward dawn. Silas stood beside his wagon with the 3 glass plates carefully arranged on a makeshift display, a wooden frame he'd built to hold them upright, backlit by lamps so the negative images would be visible. People arrived in clusters, confused and irritable at being woken early. Tua emerged from his dwelling, his face darkening when he saw what Silas had done. Ohiteka followed, already moving forward to stop whatever was happening. But Kaya's mother stepped between them and the display. Let them see, she said firmly. Let everyone see what this outsider captured before we send him away forever. Tua's jaw clenched. We agreed those images would stay hidden. You agreed. I did not. My daughter did not. And I suspect others here might want to decide for themselves what these pictures show before you make that choice for them. The crowd pressed closer, curious despite themselves. Silas said nothing, letting the images speak without interference. The first person to truly look was an older woman, one who'd been particularly vocal about Nasha being cursed. She approached the first plate skeptically, arms crossed, ready to dismiss whatever she saw. But as the image resolved in her vision, Nasha standing centered, balanced, dignified, something in her expression faltered. She leaned closer, studying details. The strong line of Nasha's shoulders, the way she held her head high despite knowing she was being judged, the quiet determination in her posture. This can't be the same woman, the older woman said, but her voice lacked conviction. It's exactly the same woman, Silas replied. The camera doesn't lie. It doesn't add beauty that isn't there. It only reveals what exists when you actually look. More people moved forward. They examined the second plate, the one taken from below. A man who'd mocked Nasha for years stared at it in uncomfortable silence. From this angle, her height transformed into something else entirely. Protection. Strength. The kind of presence that could shield rather than threaten. She looks like a guardian. someone murmured, echoing Kaya's earlier observation. She looks like she's been standing alone all this time, another voice added, and this one carried shame. The third plate drew the longest examination. The profile shot showed Nasha's face in unforgiving detail, every feature clear and undeniable. But what the image revealed wasn't deformity or curse. It was dignity earned through survival, beauty that existed not in spite of difference but within it. Ohiteka finally pushed forward, determined to maintain his position. This is manipulation. Shadow pictures can lie. They show what the photographer wants us to see. They show what the light reveals, Silas countered. Nothing more. Every detail you see here existed when I took these images. The only difference is that the camera forced you to actually look at what's been here all along. A long silence followed. People shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. Years of shared judgment weighed against the evidence of their own eyes. Then Tua spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been recognition. Where is she? Where is Nasha? The question rippled through the crowd. People turned, searching, but Nasha's dwelling remained dark and silent. She'd heard the commotion, certainly, heard people gathering, but she hadn't come. She doesn't think this will change anything, Kaya said quietly. She thinks they'll still see her the same way they always have. Tua stared at the photographs for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight that silenced everyone. These images show a woman we've treated as less than human. They show strength we've called deformity. They show dignity we've tried to erase. He paused, the admission clearly costing him. They show our failure, not hers. Ohiteka started to protest, but Tua raised his hand. No, enough. We've been wrong. These pictures prove it. The question now is whether we're strong enough to admit that and change, or whether we'll double down on our blindness to avoid facing our shame. The settlement stood at a crossroads. The photographs had done their work, revealing truth that could no longer be denied. But revelation alone didn't guarantee transformation. Someone would have to take the first step toward Nasha's dwelling. Someone would have to speak first, admit wrong first, extend recognition first. The sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the settlement. And in that new light, people began to move not away from the truth the photographs had shown them, but slowly, hesitantly, toward the woman they'd spent years refusing to see. Being seen for the first time changes everything, even when nothing else has changed at all. Nasha stood in the doorway of her dwelling, watching the settlement gather around something near Silas's wagon. She'd heard the voices, heard the unusual silence that followed, heard the murmuring that sounded different from the mockery she'd endured for years. But she hadn't moved. Hope was more dangerous than hatred. Hope could destroy you in ways that cruelty never could. Then Kaya appeared, running toward her with that fearless energy only children possessed. You have to come. You have to see what he captured. I know what he captured. The same thing everyone sees. No, Kaya insisted, grabbing her hand. It's different. Please, just look. Something in the child's voice made Nasha follow. They walked together toward the gathering, and as Nasha approached, people stepped aside. Not with their usual disgust, but with something that looked almost like respect, or maybe shame. Silas stood beside the display of glass plates, backlit by lamps in the early morning light. When he saw Nasha, he simply gestured toward the images. These belong to you more than anyone. Nasha moved forward slowly, her heart beating too fast, her hands trembling. She looked at the first plate and stopped breathing. That was her, standing exactly as she'd stood yesterday. But somehow the image showed something she'd never seen in herself. Strength, dignity, presence that commanded attention not through abnormality, but through sheer existence. The camera had captured her without the lens of judgment, without the filter of fear. The second image, taken from below, made her throat tighten. She looked powerful, protective, like someone who could shelter others rather than threaten them. Like someone whose size was gift, not curse. The third plate, the profile shot, undid her completely, her face in stark detail. And it wasn't wrong. It wasn't deformed. It was simply her marked by years of isolation. Yes, but not destroyed by them. The photograph showed survival, showed someone who'd endured what would have broken others and remained whole. That's how you see me? Nasha asked Silas, her voice breaking. That's how you are, he replied. The camera just recorded the truth. Everyone else finally looked at it. Tua stepped forward, his movements hesitant. We've wronged you, all of us, for your entire life. These images show us what we refuse to see. They show our failure. Nasha looked at the leader of her people, this man who'd enforced her isolation for decades. She wanted to accept the apology, wanted to believe transformation was possible, but years of pain didn't evaporate with words. You can't undo what was done, she said quietly. No, Tua agreed, but we can change what happens next, if you'll allow it. Over the following hours, something shifted in the settlement. Not instantly, not magically, but with the slow inevitability of ice melting in spring sun. People approached Nasha. Some apologized. Some simply stood near her without fear, letting proximity communicate what words couldn't. Children, led by Kaya, grew bold enough to ask questions, to marvel at her height without disgust. By afternoon, when Silas prepared to depart, Nasha helped load his wagon, a task that would have required 3 others. People watched, but their expressions had changed. They saw her strength now as utility, not abnormality. They saw her presence as remarkable, not wrong. Before Silas climbed onto the wagon, Nasha stopped him. What you did, showing them the truth. Thank you. I just took photographs. You're the one who had the courage to stand there and be seen. Will you leave me a copy of the images? Silas pulled out one of the glass plates, the profile shot carefully wrapped in cloth. This one's yours. So you can remember that someone saw you clearly, and so you never forget what you actually are, regardless of what anyone else thinks. Nasha held the plate carefully, as if it were more precious than gold. In a way, it was. It was proof, evidence that she existed beyond judgment, beyond fear, beyond the narrow definitions others had tried to force upon her. As Silas's wagon rolled away, Nasha stood watching. The settlement continued its routines around her, but she was no longer invisible. She was no longer erased. And while acceptance would take time, while trust would need to be rebuilt slowly, the first step had been taken. That evening, Tua asked the settlement to gather. He hung the remaining 2 photograph plates in the central dwelling, where everyone would see them daily, not as curiosities, not as reminders of abnormality, but as evidence that truth existed beyond assumption, and that sometimes it took an outsider's impartial eye to show a community what had been there all along. Nasha stood among her people for the first time in memory. Not apart from them, not hidden at the edges, but present, seen, acknowledged. The photograph had revealed her true beauty to the tribe. Now the harder work began, learning to see it in themselves. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and truth collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.